People think the Amish just wear plain, dark dresses and that's the end of it. But let me tell you, there are so many rules about what you can and cannot wear that it would make your head spin. And I grew up learning every single one of them the hard way. Growing up, my mother only allowed me to buy fabric from the Amish fabric store. And even then, she had a very narrow idea of what was acceptable out of everything on those shelves. So it wasn't like the whole store was mine to choose from, not even close. The first word you need to understand if you want to make sense of any of this is fancy, because that word controlled almost everything about what I was allowed to wear. If my mother looked at a fabric or a color and said it was fancy, that meant it was too worldly, too showy, not plain enough for our community tatching. And that dress was not coming home with me, period. Now I want to walk you through a whole bunch of fabrics and colors and explain each one, because the differences are so subtle sometimes that you wouldn't even notice them unless you were raised in it like I was. This dress right here, for example, you can barely see the pattern, but it's there. Just the faintest little texture in the fabric. And this color, this kind of muted everyday color, was perfectly acceptable for almost everyone in my community, even the stricter families. And my mother would have had no problem with this one at all. But this color over here, this dusty rose, this pinkish shade, most of my childhood I was not allowed anywhere near a color like this. And it wasn't until I started my Rumspringa at 17 that my mother even reluctantly allowed it. And even then she wasn't thrilled about it, she just let it go. Pink was something most women in my community did not wear. Maybe a very soft, dusty shade during Rumspringa, maybe. And bright pink was simply out of the question for anyone at any age. Now, this wine-colored dress, I loved this color so much when I was younger, and my mother was genuinely unhappy that I wanted it, but she did eventually allow a softer version of it when I got a little older. Though this particular one I bought with my own money after I moved out, because standing in the sunlight it almost looks red, and we were absolutely not allowed to wear red. Not ever. And my mother would have had something to say about that immediately. The fabric on this one has these bigger square patterns woven into it, and that alone would have made my mother say it was not Amish enough. Completely apart from the color. This purple dress, purple is my absolute favorite color. It has been since I was small, and I was not allowed to wear it growing up. Not a true purple like this, only a very pale lavender, and even that was considered borderline depending on the church and the family. I bought this one with my own money too, after I was out on my own. And it still feels like a small act of freedom every time I look at it. In our community, it was really about 50-50, whether a family allowed purple or not. Some did, some didn't. But a rich purple like this would have been considered fancy by my mother, without a second thought. This bright blue dress, though, blue was almost always more acceptable. And I think I was allowed to wear a color like this even as a younger girl, because bright blue and bright green tend to get a pass in Amish communities in a way that other bright colors simply do not. My mother would have found this particular shade too bright for herself, but plenty of married women wore colors like this without anyone saying a word. Though she would have raised an eyebrow at the pattern in this fabric because it has a slightly decorative weave to it, and she preferred fabrics that were more plain and simple with no visible pattern at all. This light-colored dress would have required a slip underneath because you could see through it in the right light, and wearing a slip is just extra effort nobody really wants. So lighter colors always came with that condition attached. This rust-colored dress I actually wore and loved during my time as a member of the community. It looked even brighter standing in the sun, and I think my father was not pleased about that. Because in sunlight, it was pushing toward, what they would call too fancy, but the fabric itself, that soft, crinkled texture with the faint, tiny pattern, was one of my favorites for how it felt to wear every single day. This light blue is the kind of color that was very widely accepted because it reads as plain and modest. But my mother did not like this dress because of the fabric pattern, even though the color itself would have been fine. Charcoal was always safe. It is one of those colors that nobody argues about because it reads as plain for everyone, men and women both. Orange and peach, on the other hand, were considered fancy. I saw some girls in Rumspringa wearing a peach dress, and it was always something that stood out. And you would not catch a married woman in that color. Yellow was something that crept into my life very slowly. I had to wait until I was maybe 18 or 19 before my mother finally let me have yellow curtains. And even then they had to be so pale, they almost looked cream in the light. And yellow dresses were something only certain girls in Rumspringa might wear, never really married women. Black is its own category entirely, because every Amish woman is supposed to have a black dress on hand at all times in case of death. It is tradition that when an Amish woman passes, she is dressed in black, and so that black dress has to be the plainest dress you own, plainer than anything else in your wardrobe, because it is sacred in that way. The complicated truth is that so much of this came down to your parents and how strictly they interpreted the church's standards. Some families were more lenient and their daughters got to wear fabrics and colors I could only look at on the shelf, and other families were stricter than mine even, which was hard to imagine sometimes. My mother could not always make up her mind, and I did not always want what she wanted me to wear. And that tension was just part of growing up the way I did, always knowing that the dress you loved most was probably the one you were least allowed to have.